So the lead combat designer of the Final Fantasy VII Remake Trilogy, Teruki Endo, recently held a panel at GDC, spilling all the beans on how he crafted this incredible combat system for the Remake Trilogy, and we're going to be breaking that down in today's video. Everything from strategy, perfecting the flow of combat, and even making use of one simple button on a controller. It's pretty interesting stuff, so if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here, you can subscribe, and as always, leave your thoughts in the comments down below. So Endo-san recently attended GDC and held an hour-long panel explaining to developers how he crafted the incredible combat system of the Final Fantasy VII Remake Trilogy, and thanks to Noisy Pixel, we've got a breakdown of this panel. So starting off first, for those of you who are not familiar with Teruki Endo, he originally worked for Capcom back in 2008. He joined them and he would work on the Monster Hunter franchise, specifically as an action designer as well as an action planner for those games. And Monster Hunter games are super cool. There's a lot of depth there in their combat, and the franchise itself is blowing up. It's just gotten bigger and bigger over the past 5 years or so, and they just recently released Monster Hunter Wilds, which is doing gangbusters. But back in 2018, Endo would leave Capcom and join Square Enix and become the lead combat designer for the Remake Trilogy. Now, what's super interesting is that they had been developing this game for quite some time, and Endo would come in halfway through that game's development for 7 Remake. The game's co-director, Naoki Hamaguchi, who is now the lead director of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, said that before Endo-san came in, the combat in 7 Remake just did not feel good to play. They couldn't figure it out. The command-based menu stuff was easy. They had done that previously, no issues there, but the action just didn't feel right. So Endo would come in, and within 6 months, this man would craft the combat system that they would then use for Remake and Rebirth, and after creating it, they would spend about a year polishing it up, making sure it was the best it could possibly be. And that combat system would only expand further in Rebirth. And funny enough, Endo-san said that one of his biggest regrets in 7 Remake was making the scope of combat too narrow, which is why Rebirth kind of busts things open for the better. So moving on to the panel, we start off with the section, A Hybrid of Strategy and Action. Noisy Pixel goes on to write, one of the defining features of 7 Remake is its fusion of action-based combat with the strategic depth of the original's turn-based system. Endo-san emphasized that Square Enix's goal was not simply abandoning traditional command-based battles, but evolving them into something more dynamic. The result? A system where real-time attacks charge the ATB, active time battle gauge, allowing players to pause the action and execute special moves, magic, or item usage. This balance between high-speed action and strategic decision-making became the foundation for Rebirth's combat, with refinements designed to offer even greater player expression and tactical depth. And that's one of the reasons why I love this combat system so much, is that it still retains that classic essence of older Final Fantasy, specifically OG FF7 with the command-based menu system, but it also embraces the new by doing real-time action. But you can't do one without the other. They work synergistically, no pun intended there. You don't just wait for your ATB to build up, you actually have to perform action-based commands in order to build up that ATB. And then once it's available, you can switch over to that command-based menu system, do your attacks, your abilities, items, magic, summons, you name it. And what's nice is when you enter that command-based menu, which is tactical mode, time slows down, so you're given a good amount of time to figure out, okay, what is it that I actually want to do, which still embraces that classic turn-based aspect of the original Final Fantasy games. It's still alive and well. And that strategy, that depth is 100% still there. And I've seen some criticisms from people saying, well, the original games, I feel like they had way more strategy involved because you had to get your materia set up, and then you had to pick your commands and figure it out in battle. And to me, all of that stuff is still there in the Remake Trilogy's combat system, but now you're just doing it in real time on the fly, which I think makes it way more exhilarating. And having grown up with this franchise, and I remember watching Advent Children as a kid, and I saw Cloud and Sephiroth flying around fighting each other, I wanted that, or something close to it. And we ended up getting that with this trilogy. It's fast, it's fluid, it's responsive, and still allows you to play with a level of strategy and depth that I think is really addictive, especially when you're overcoming specific odds. Up next, Endo talks about perfecting the flow of combat. Transitioning from pure turn-based battles to an action-focused system wasn't without its difficulties. Endo-san highlighted how crucial it was to maintain the Final Fantasy feel, the thrill of making the right decisions at the right moment. This challenge led to the development of the stagger system, a mechanic that rewards players for exploiting enemy weaknesses, temporarily immobilizing foes, and allowing for devastating combos. Additionally, Rebirth enhances the individuality of each playable character, pushing players to swap between them dynamically. Cloud retains his balanced mix of melee and magic, while Tifa's rapid strikes make her a stagger-building powerhouse. Barret provides ranged versatility, and Aerith specializes in potent magic and support. Endo-san noted that these distinctions ensure that no character feels redundant, promoting strategic party switching during battles. And again, he just gets it. This is someone who's been working with action-based combat for a very, very long time, and he said that when he joined Square Enix and worked on this project, he wanted to do something different that would push himself, something that he hadn't done before at Capcom, and this is what we ended up with. It's incredible. But like we mentioned earlier, that strategy is still there, especially with the stagger system. You're pressuring an enemy, you find out what its weakness is, and then you work around that weakness with your characters, whether it's using your spells or specific abilities that might make it easier to pressure and then stagger said enemy. I can't tell you how satisfying it is in a boss battle to stagger an enemy and then hit that bitch with stop. Stopping them in their tracks and then wailing on them with abilities, synergy abilities, sometimes limit breaks. The footage that I'm playing for you guys right now, I think perfectly exemplifies how amazing this combat system is. I was fighting Gina Tak on hard mode and I was getting walloped. I took a break, came back the next day, reconfigured my equipment, my materia, and I went in with a strategy. And it worked. I knocked that dude out in my first attempt. And I didn't do it just by spamming things, I did it because I utilized the special abilities and individuality of my respective characters, Red 13 and Barret. Red 13, when you really use him properly, he can pretty much block every attack with Sentinel stance, so a lot of Gina Tak's projectiles were rendered useless against Red when he was in that mode. I could then switch to Barret and provide support either through healing and doing quick rapid damage with his gun, as well as the overcharge ability. And that's what makes the character so cool, is it's not just, oh, I'm gonna put these pieces of equipment and materia on all of these characters and they're all just gonna play the same. It's almost like a fighting game where each character is so unique, they're almost their own class. As they describe here in the article, Cloud is that fast melee guy, but he's also pretty solid with magic. Tifa is so fast that she can pressure and stagger an enemy no problem. Aerith, once you get those wards set up, she is an absolute nightmare to deal with. Barret is the tank. He can do that range damage. He's kind of okay with magic. He can also absorb damage from your party and provide some really great support, but he hits really heavy. And Red is almost kind of like a defensive tank. Again, something like Sentinel stance absorbs a lot of damage, which builds up his vengeance gauge. And once that vengeance mode is unlocked, he can do a lot of cool stuff like heal the party, cast haste, heal himself. All of his base attacks get stronger, and he's incredibly fast and mobile. And it's going to be really interesting to see how they improve upon Red in Part 3, because all of our base characters got improvements from Remake to Rebirth. Cloud is infinitely more fun to use in Rebirth than he was in 7 Remake. Air combat in general is a lot better in Rebirth than it was in Remake, so I'm curious to see how they improve upon someone like Red. Up next, Endo talks about balancing accessibility with depth. Endo-san described the battle system as existing in 3 phases. The first one, the preparation phase. Players set up their materia, abilities, and party strategy before combat begins. Second, the engagement phase. Action unfolds as players attack, dodge, and manage ATB in real time. In the third stage, execution phase, ATB charges allow for powerful tactical moves, turning the tide of battle. This structure ensures Rebirth's combat remains engaging for both action-focused players and those who prefer a more methodical strategic approach. And it's kind of funny because all of this stuff plays out in real time, but you're not always thinking about it because of how fast and frenetic combat can be. So when you're fighting a boss on the fly, everything is kind of scary at first. Maybe you're getting walloped, but then I think all of us have that moment where something just clicks and it's like, okay, I know what I need to do. I'm gonna do this, 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 and this. And the next thing you know, you've staggered the enemy, you hit him with stop, you're doing incredible damage, and you've moved on to the next phase. Now up next, we have some photos from the panel itself where Endo breaks down a few more things. Starting off with creating variety in moves and enemies. He goes on to say, if combat is too simple, everything will feel monotonous and the player would get tired of it. We want to think about creating variety from the start without getting overly complex. He would then say, I worked on the design while thinking about how much variety can I create within the system I'm trying to implement. And that kind of goes back to one of his own criticisms again about Remake feeling a little too narrow and really busting things open with Rebirth, and they truly did that. They gave players way more options, and I never really felt like combat got boring because again, you're switching from character to character who are all inherently different, but you're also fighting enemies that are just inherently different depending on the regions you're in or whatever boss battles you might be in. And I feel like things get just the right amount of difficult without feeling overwhelming or cheap or overly complex, which again is one of the things they wanted to avoid. Up next is a really interesting one called Thinking Phases Should Fluctuate in Importance. Create variety by implementing elements that fluctuate depending on the player's playstyle and enemy type. And essentially what this means here is talking about custom builds, kitting out a character the way that you want, whether it's materia or equipment. And he also emphasizes that he wanted players to be able to create builds that relied solely on the command menu instead of just action, which is pretty cool. And there's tons of materia that gives you an advantage right out of the gate, whether it comes to like first strike or even pieces of equipment and even weapon abilities that charge up your ATB a lot faster than just relying solely on the action stuff. So again, there's tons of variety here, and there's even the classic mode where the computer will basically do all of the action for you and you're just solely figuring out all of your command-based stuff, which is kind of harkening back to the original game, except there's way more action, but again, you're just focused on picking your actions in that command-based menu. Up next is considering the battle foundation, how situations change during combat. We want players to feel exhilarated when they overcome a situation by executing the right set of commands. Adding more simple action elements wouldn't help us meet that goal. And I think that kind of falls into the balance category. I think they've added just the right amount of mechanics to Rebirth to where it doesn't feel overwhelming, whether it's the synergy skills and abilities, utilizing those properly, which kind of says to me that maybe for part 3 they won't add too much new stuff in terms of like some of those action elements. I do fully expect things like Tritex and new synergy stuff, but I don't think we're gonna have like a 3rd or 4th synergy addition to the combat in terms of like the synergy skills. Up next, this one is super cool and important, and I think this is something that comes from his background working at Capcom. He goes on to say, we may be able to create more variety in the commands if the player can clearly feel the timing to rush in or to guard or to regain their footing. Some of the examples: timing to guard or to regain their footing. With limited HP, we can naturally create moments when the player is caught in a pinch. Timing to rush in. Predictable enemy reactions are one thing, but a system-wide approach is needed for a battle system with clear ups and downs in the flow of combat. And the player feel in this game is so good. Again, the characters are incredibly responsive, but I want to focus on that timing to guard or to regain their footing. In Remake, you could only block enemies, but in Rebirth, they added a just frame parry, meaning if you press the block button at the right time as the enemy strikes you, you're gonna parry that asshole. You get a satisfying sound effect, you take 0 damage, you stagger them a little bit, and then you can run in and do some really cool stuff. And when you're able to do that in a situation where maybe your HP is low or maybe 2 of your party members are down, and then it allows you to create a rally where you're coming back and really turning the tides of battle, is so exhilarating, man. They just completely nailed it with that aspect. And focusing on that last one, I never really felt like I was in a boss battle and I'm like, okay, I need to memorize the pattern of an enemy. They clearly have abilities that they will use over and over again in their different phases, but it never really felt like, okay, he's gonna do this, and then he's gonna do that, and then they're gonna do this, and I have to be prepared for all of it. You're kind of just adjusting on the fly, and it feels dynamic, which I really appreciate. Up next was roles within the battle party. We kind of covered this a little bit early, how every character has a different role to play because they're essentially their own task. But he goes on further to say that clarifying the roles lets us keep the project direction intact when developing ideas for abilities. And for me, I'm not a developer, and this is primarily a panel that was meant for developers, people who are actively working on games or getting into game development. So this is information that they're going to want to focus on. But for me, like a layman's term here, I assume like you know who your characters are, you know what their specific classes are and what they can and can't do. That kind of keeps you focused on, okay, well, we're not going to suddenly have Aerith be a melee character, or suddenly Cloud is going to be a ranged attacker. So when you're coming up with new ideas for these characters, everything just kind of naturally falls into place for them. You know Cloud's going to be that melee guy, so you should focus on things that really kind of suit his kit. That's kind of how I see it anyway. Up next, we get the focus on the triangle button, action-based characteristics. One button, the triangle button for PlayStation, makes a big difference in the character-specific action-oriented behavior. Too much difference in play across all buttons makes it harder to use various characters. Would like players to be able to control every character to some degree with the learned base system. However, if all the buttons play the same, it becomes less fun to change characters. Which again, just kind of goes hand in hand in the whole making every character feel different. It really is like a fighting game. And rather than just have your basic attacks with square and then building up ATB, we've got that unique ability that every character has. Cloud can press triangle and go into Punisher mode. Tifa's changes based on her chi level. Barrett can do the overcharge. Red's got vengeance. Aerith has her tempest ability. It's kind of funny how one simple button can add a unique flair to combat and make it feel fresh and make every character feel different. You don't want every character to do the same thing. If you press triangle with Cloud and he did a big old attack, and then you switch to Barrett and he did a big old attack, and then Tifa's was a big old attack, and it just goes on and on and on and doesn't feel unique, that gets super repetitive. But if you go too far and make things way too different, like Endo points out here, then it's like, I don't really know how to use everyone to their full advantage. You want everyone to be able to learn every character to some degree because you're going to be using everyone at some point in this game. Up next is enemy design and the need for adaptation. A major aspect of Rebirth's combat improvements comes from its enemy variety. Endo-san emphasized that encounters are designed to push players to adapt, whether facing heavily armored foes that require magic or aerial enemies best handled with ranged attacks. By designing enemies with distinct strengths and weaknesses, Rebirth maintains an ever-evolving sense of challenge and strategy. And again, that just kind of falls in line with every character feeling different and playing different, but also having their specific strengths when it comes to what enemies they're best at. If you got a flying enemy, you know you're going to want to have Barrett and Aerith there, and Yuffie, they're going to have the easiest time taking out those enemies, although you could use a synergy skill and throw Tifa up there. That always works too. But for optimal combat, you're going to want those specific characters to handle those specific enemies. And as we come to the end, we have some closing statements from Endo himself where they say, as development continues on the remake project, Endo-san and his team continue to fine-tune the combat to deliver an experience that resonates with players. His closing advice to aspiring game developers was simple: embrace challenges, no matter how small, as each step contributes to growth as a creator. And then we have one final message from Endo, a new personal challenge. As a developer whose career has been dedicated to making action games, my job change sparked a desire to approach game development differently. Thus, this system was a new personal challenge I set for myself. And what an incredible combat system it is. It has officially become one of my favorite, if not my favorite combat systems in any game I think I've ever played. Again, it has that incredible mix of what made the original Final Fantasy so great with the command-based, turn-based stuff in ATB, but they throw in just the right amount of action, just the right amount of control to make it feel more dynamic, and everything just works together so perfectly. And seeing the jump from Remake to Rebirth, all of those criticisms that they themselves may have had of Remake's combat system, but also criticisms that we had. One of the biggest ones was air combat in Remake just didn't feel good. We got to integrate, and with a character like Yuffie, they really adapted with that, and combat started to feel so much better with her specifically. And then we get to Rebirth, and they just bust the doors open. Oh, you didn't like air combat in Remake? Well, now it's better. Throw Tifa up there, or Cloud's gonna lunge himself up there, and they can deal with enemies so much easier. Combat just feels like they made the right amount of upgrades from Remake to Rebirth without it feeling overwhelming or too different. And I'm very curious again to see what changes they make to Part 3, because everything in this remake trilogy, whether it's the story, exploration, or combat, has all changed from game to game. So I'm very curious to see what they do in Part 3 with the combat system. Again, I kind of expect them to do things like Tritex, which would be synergy abilities with 3 characters, maybe even something as crazy as synergy limit breaks could be a thing. What changes, like I mentioned earlier, are they going to have for characters like Red 13 and Kate Sith, who are brand new to Rebirth, but you know they're going to want to change things in Part 3. And then we have the introduction of new characters, Cid and Vincent. How are they going to play? What are their roles specifically going to be in combat? I would assume Cid would be like a mid-range to close-range enemy that's kind of close to what Cloud can do, except maybe he could be a little bit faster. Vincent might be that glass cannon who can do ranged attacks, but when he's close, maybe he's got some melee stuff. And then there's, of course, all of the crazy transformations that he could do, which could then themselves turn into specific abilities he could use in combat without having to use the limit break all the time. And if I just have one last closing thing to say, I genuinely really love this combat system. Going through on hard mode, it makes the combat system shine even brighter because my first playthrough was on dynamic and it felt like a pretty good difficulty setting to play that game for the first time. But when you get to hard mode, you really gotta prioritize your equipment, your materia, and all of your strategies and abilities in battle to really topple some of these bosses. Otherwise, they're just gonna walk all over you. And with a combat system this well crafted, this well polished, I really would love to see it again moving forward, even once this remake trilogy is finished. If they decide to do a Final Fantasy XVII or an 18, I really would love to see them take this combat system, which is so good, and use it in future Final Fantasy games, iterating with each new game like they've done with Remake, Rebirth, and what they will do with Part 3. Because it really, again, is what I feel like is the new identity of Final Fantasy. You still have that traditional turn-based, command-based menu stuff with the ATB, but you're embracing the new stuff with the action, with the synergy abilities, with all the real-time stuff. It really is the perfect blend for this franchise, and I would love to see it as the gameplay identity moving forward. So thank you to Endo-san and everyone that works with him to craft this combat system. Again, it's not just Endo, he is the lead combat designer. He came up with all of the stuff for the combat system, but there are so many people that work with him to plan out the combat in terms of enemies and bosses and all kinds of stuff that is super important to making sure this stuff works properly. So with that being said, that is the video. I hope that at some point in the future they do make this panel available as a video to watch online. I do believe it's available on the GDC website through their vault, but I think that is meant for big studios and companies that have a lot of money, because from what I've seen, the vault subscription is pretty expensive. So I don't think it's meant for normies like us. And this entire panel itself was aimed mostly at game developers, so there might have been some stuff that was a little bit dry. So I kind of tried my best to, kind of simplify it because I'm not the smartest person in the world, and make it a little bit more digestible. But with that being said, let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think of this game's combat system? I think it's almost universally praised. There are some people on Twitter, which the more I use Twitter, the more I just want to delete the app. It's just such a cesspool over there of negativity and cynicism. I've seen so many hot takes on this game's combat system saying that it sucks. It's no different than any other action RPG. It's worse than 16's combat. I've seen people complain that in Remake you could use level 3 spells with 1 ATB, and they don't like the change in Rebirth where you now have to use 2 ATB bars to use a level 3 spell, and they don't like that when you cast the spell, if an enemy hits you, it cancels the spell and then you lose your ATB. And I'm like, that's part of the strategy. That's part of the combat of that game. You can't just spam that stuff willy-nilly. It'd be too easy. And again, everyone's entitled to their opinions, but I feel like those people on Twitter are high AF. Some weird-ass people over there. But anyway, stepping off of my soapbox, let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think of this combat system? Were you familiar with Teruki Endo before he joined Square Enix? I'd love to hear what you guys think in the comments down below, especially about Monster Hunter, because that's where he came from, working with Capcom. I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.